The streets were packed as usual, people rushing past, some lost in their own world, others merely going through the motions of life. Among them was a man, mid-30s, rough around the edges, his clothes worn, his face hardened by the weight of the world. He had been running from something, maybe life, maybe himself. His eyes were wild, desperate for a way out, and for a moment, the world seemed like it was closing in on him. He spotted the police officer standing near a corner, chatting with a passerby. His gut twisted with something he couldn't fully explain, a mix of anger and fear, maybe even shame. Without thinking, he strode up to the officer, a sneer playing across his lips. It was impulsive, reckless. He was tired of feeling helpless, of being pushed around by the system, by everything. He pushed the officer, just a shove, nothing too violent, but enough to make a statement, to feel something other than being invisible. The officer didn't move at first. There was a calm in his stance, an air of authority that most people would never challenge. But this man had lost all reason, his mind clouded by years of built-up frustration. He wanted to feel powerful, even if only for a moment. The crowd around them stopped. They all waited, the tension in the air thick and palpable. The officer's hand shot up faster than the man could register, grabbing his wrist in a vice-like grip. The pressure in the man's arm was immediate, and before he could process what was happening, he found himself slammed against the cold concrete wall. It was swift, precise. His breath caught in his throat as the officer's voice cut through the silence. "You think that's going to change anything?" the officer asked, his tone calm yet filled with an underlying authority that didn't need to yell. The man's eyes widened. For the first time in years, he was truly seen, not as an outcast or a faceless rebel, but as a man who had made a choice. His impulsive act had now turned into something more, something real. He had thought he was in control, but now he was nothing more than a pawn in a game he didn't understand. He tried to pull away, but the officer held firm. His mind raced. He had expected anger, maybe fear. What he didn't expect was the quiet pity in the officer's eyes. The officer wasn't just a figure of authority. He was a person, a human who saw through the anger and understood what led him here. The officer's grip softened just a fraction, enough to allow the man to breathe, but not enough to escape. "I've seen people like you before," the officer said softly. "Angry, lost, but pushing people doesn't get you anywhere." The man's heart hammered in his chest. Was this it? Was this his wake-up call? Or was he just another angry man in the crowd, destined to be forgotten? The officer's words cut deeper than any blow could. He wasn't mad anymore, he was ashamed. In that moment, the man understood something fundamental. The power to change, to move forward, wasn't about shoving others down. It was about lifting himself up. The officer had shown him a glimpse of something he didn't know he needed. Respect. For himself. For others. The crowd started moving again, and the man found himself standing there, frozen, not sure what to do next. He had expected a fight, a clash, but instead he had met his own reflection. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long while, he knew it was up to him to choose which direction he would take. The officer gave him one last look, something between understanding and resignation, and then let him go. The man stood there, still catching his breath, not sure if he should thank him or run away. But as he turned and walked off, something inside him shifted. Maybe he wasn't lost after all. Maybe there was still a chance to find his way. And maybe, just maybe, he had just learned the most important lesson of all. The fight wasn't with the world. It was with himself. Days passed, and the man's life seemed to return to its usual rhythm. Yet there was something different. It wasn't the same chaos he had felt before. There was a shift in the air. A subtle change he couldn't fully grasp but felt deep inside. He woke up one morning, staring at the same cracked ceiling he had for years, but now the cracks didn't seem as deep. He got out of bed, not with the usual bitterness in his steps but with a strange sense of clarity. He didn't know if it was the officer's words or the way his actions had momentarily been questioned. But for the first time in a long while, he considered his future. He had always thought the world owed him something, that he had been wronged by life, but now, There was a small voice inside him that questioned that narrative. Was he just another victim of his own choices? He went about his day, walking through the streets with the weight of his past still on his shoulders but a flicker of hope that had never been there before. It was then that he saw the officer again. The same man who had shown him what true power looked like. The kind that wasn't about physical dominance, but about presence, about choosing a path of dignity. This time, the man didn't feel the need to prove anything. No anger, no resentment, just a simple acknowledgement. He walked up to the officer, who stood by his patrol car, looking almost as if he was waiting. The man hesitated for a moment but then spoke, his voice steady, almost apologetic. "I owe you an apology," he said, not entirely sure where this was coming from, but it felt right. The officer turned slowly, his expression unchanged, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "You don't owe me anything," he said calmly, a small smile playing on his lips. "You just need to owe yourself the truth. That's all." The words hit harder than any apology could. The man felt something shift again, not in the officer's response, but in himself. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about self-realization. He had been running not from the world, but from himself. They stood there for a moment, and then the officer's voice broke the silence. Life isn't about fighting for control. It's about knowing when to stop fighting. Sometimes, it's about taking a step back and letting go of your need to prove something. The man nodded slowly. He still didn't have all the answers, but he wasn't the same person who had pushed the officer a few days ago. There was growth now, small but real. "I don't know if I can ever fully change, but I'll try," the man said, his voice quieter now, the weight of his words settling in. The officer gave him a look that said everything without saying a word. "That's all anyone can ask for," he said. And just like that, the world didn't feel so heavy anymore. The man didn't need to prove his strength by pushing others down. For the first time, he realized that his greatest strength would come from his willingness to stop and face the things he had been running from. As he walked away, the sounds of the city seemed quieter, less demanding. There was peace in the unknown now, a peace that came not from avoiding life's challenges, but from accepting them. And in that moment, he understood that the hardest battle was not with the world. It was with himself. The officer watched him walk away, a hint of pride in his eyes. It wasn't about winning a fight. It was about a man choosing to fight for himself, to choose a better path. The real victory, he knew, was when someone realized they didn't have to keep fighting. And as the man disappeared into the crowd, the officer allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. This wasn't just about a moment. It was about the journey that would follow, for both of them. The man walked away, each step more grounded than the last. There was a strange lightness in his chest, as though the weight of years of frustration was slowly starting to lift. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time he felt that maybe, just maybe, he had the power to shape his own future. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, but it didn't feel oppressive. The world seemed to open up in a way he hadn't imagined before. He could hear the usual noise of the city. Cars honking, people chatting, the distant hum of life continuing as it always did. But this time, he felt part of it. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. He made his way through the crowd, passing familiar faces, but something about the way they looked at him felt different. There was a quiet acknowledgement in their eyes, as if they could see the change in him, even if it was still small. He wasn't sure what it was, but the world around him had somehow shifted. He felt seen. It was when he reached the corner, the same place he had confronted the officer days ago, that he saw her, the little girl. She was standing on the sidewalk, her back straight, eyes wide, holding a sign that read, "Help me." For a moment he hesitated. The words help and hope had always seemed so distant from his reality. He had never felt like he had anything to offer anyone, let alone a little girl. But something inside him stirred. He walked over, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. The little girl looked up at him, her big eyes full of uncertainty, but there was a strength in her gaze that he hadn't expected. "I need help with something," she said quietly, her voice small but determined. He knelt down in front of her, the city around them a blur. For a moment, he saw a reflection of his own vulnerability in her. This child, standing alone, asking for help, yet holding on to something deep inside. She didn't say what she needed, but he could see it in her eyes. Hope, fear, the desire for something more than what life had given her so far. "I can help," he said, the words coming out more naturally than he had expected. The girl hesitated, then held out a small piece of paper. "I want to be a scientist," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But my mom doesn't think I can. She says it's too expensive, that I won't make it." He took the paper from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The weight of it wasn't in the paper, it was in her words. He remembered what it felt like to be told you couldn't do something, to be held back by the world's expectations. He remembered all the moments in his life when he had been told he was too much or too little. "You want to be a scientist?" he asked, his heart swelling with a kind of pride that surprised him. The girl nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "But I don't have the money. I can't afford school. And no one believes I can do it." Something inside him broke open. This wasn't just about her. It was about all the people like her. People who had dreams but no resources, no support. He knew he couldn't change everything, but maybe he could change this one thing. He stood up, pulling his phone from his pocket. Without a word, he started typing, sending a message to someone he knew in the tech world. A connection who had been a part of his journey, someone who could make things happen. "I know a few people who might help," he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "I can't promise anything, but I'll do what I can." The little girl's eyes widened, and for the first time, she smiled. A real smile, full of hope. It wasn't a smile that meant she was already saved, but it was the kind of smile that said she might just have a chance now. As he turned to leave, the girl's voice stopped him. "Thank you," she said, her words simple but filled with gratitude. "I didn't think anyone would care." He looked back at her, the weight of the past few days crashing over him. It's not about caring. It's about choosing to do something. You've got to choose to fight for your dream. "I'm just helping you take the first step." She nodded, a sense of determination creeping into her expression. And for the first time in a long while, he believed her. She would get there. She would fight for her dream. And in doing so, she would remind him that he wasn't just helping her, he was helping himself too. As he walked away, he felt something different, something deep. He wasn't running anymore, and he wasn't alone. Not in this fight. Not anymore. The next few days felt like a strange kind of awakening. The man had stepped into a new world. A world that didn't revolve around anger, frustration, or hopelessness, but around the possibility of change. The connection he had made with that little girl, and the simple act of reaching out to help her, had sparked something inside him that he couldn't ignore. He realized how small, seemingly insignificant acts of kindness had the power to ripple through someone's life in ways they couldn't fully understand. Every time he thought back to her smile, to the gratitude in her eyes, it reminded him of what it meant to truly give. But as the days passed, the man also knew something else was coming. This wasn't going to be easy. Helping others meant being vulnerable, opening yourself up to the possibility of failure, of not being able to fix everything. He didn't know how far he could take it, but he wasn't going to turn away now. It wasn't long before he found himself back on the streets again. But this time, it wasn't with the same aimless steps he had taken before. There was a sense of purpose to his walk. He passed by the familiar crowds, but his eyes were sharper now, more aware of the people around him, the stories hidden in plain sight. He stopped at a small coffee shop, the same one he had passed by countless times but never really noticed. He walked in, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window. His mind wandered back to the officer, the words he had spoken. Sometimes, it's about taking a step back and letting go of your need to prove something. He had felt that truth deep within himself. It wasn't just about confrontation anymore. It was about choosing to act with intention. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard a familiar voice. It was the officer, the the same one who had helped him see that moment of clarity. The officer was standing at the door, scanning the room for someone. His eyes landed on the man, and a brief moment of recognition passed between them. The officer walked over, his presence calming, almost reassuring. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. The man shrugged, feeling an odd comfort in the officer's casual tone. "Guess I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant, "about everything, about how people, end up where they do." The officer took a seat across from him, his gaze steady. "And what have you figured out?" The man took a deep breath. "I used to think everything was just random, that some people got lucky, others didn't, that it was all about making the right moves and winning." The officer nodded, waiting for him to continue. "But now I'm not so sure. I think it's about how you choose to act, even when you feel like you're losing. Like the little girl I met. She's just one person, but her dreams matter. And I guess so do mine." The officer leaned back, his expression softening. "It's funny how things work out. We spend so much time focused on the big picture, on what's next. We forget about the little moments, the ones that shape us in ways we don't expect." The man nodded slowly, understanding. It wasn't just about doing something for the sake of doing it. It was about making sure the things you did meant something, that they were connected to the person you were becoming. There was a quiet pause between them, both of them contemplating the weight of their words. Then the officer spoke again, this time with a more serious tone. "I want to ask you something," the officer said, his voice steady. "When you helped that girl, did you really think about the consequences of your actions?" The man blinked, surprised by the question. I didn't really think about it. I just saw someone who needed help, and I wanted to do something about it." The officer's gaze hardened slightly, as though testing him. "You see, sometimes doing the right thing isn't always easy. It's not always going to be the happy ending you want. It might not even turn out the way you expect." The man frowned, uncertainty creeping in. "What do you mean?" The officer leaned in, his voice low. "Sometimes, when you help someone, you change their life in ways you can't predict. But what if that change doesn't turn out the way you want it to? What if your good intentions end up causing more harm than good?" The words hit the man harder than he expected. He had always believed that helping people was inherently good, that every act of kindness would lead to positive outcomes. But what if the officer was right? What if he was about to make a choice that would backfire? The officer watched him closely, his eyes steady. "Not every act of kindness is rewarded in the way we expect. That's the risk. But it's also the beauty of it. You can't always control the outcome, but you can control your intentions." The man sat back in his chair, feeling a wave of doubt wash over him. He had helped someone, but what if it didn't lead to the future she imagined? What if his attempt to make a difference was just a small part of a much larger, more complicated picture? For the first time, he realized that helping others meant taking risks. It meant stepping into the unknown, knowing that not every path would lead to a perfect resolution. But despite that, he also knew one thing. He couldn't turn away now. He had already taken the first step, and that was enough. As he left the coffee shop later that day, his mind was still heavy with the officer's words. But he had a new understanding. Sometimes the true act of kindness wasn't just in what you did for someone else. It was in the courage to face the uncertainty that came with it. And as the world around him continued to move, he was ready to walk alongside it. Uncertain of the future but determined to make a difference anyway. The days blurred into one another, each moment a quiet reflection of the lessons that had slowly begun to shape the man's understanding of himself. Every encounter, every thought, felt like a step forward. Yet the deeper he ventured into this newfound sense of purpose, the more the questions seemed to multiply. Was he really capable of change? Could he continue on this path when the stakes felt so high? He had helped the girl, but what if the ripple he had started would carry unintended consequences? The officer's words echoed in his mind. You can't always control the outcome, but you can control your intentions. It was a strange kind of comfort, but also a heavy responsibility. There were moments when the weight of it felt almost unbearable. Would he keep moving forward, even when he wasn't sure of the consequences. And more importantly, could he face the truth about his own shortcomings in the process? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself standing in front of the same coffee shop where his conversation with the officer had unfolded. The streets were quieter now. The usual rush of activity slowed as the night began to settle in. He hesitated before pushing the door open, his mind racing. He had a sense that something was calling him back, something he had yet to face. As he stepped inside, he was surprised to see the officer seated at the same table where they had spoken weeks before. The officer's eyes met his, and there was something different in his gaze, a kind of knowing, a sense that the man's journey was about to take another turn. "You've been thinking," the officer said, his tone not a question, but an observation. "I can see it." The man sat down slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I feel like I'm stuck in this cycle of trying to fix things. But what if I'm not meant to? What if the change I think I'm creating is just a false hope?" The officer leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "That's the thing about change. It's never easy, and it's never linear. You might do something for someone else, and it might not be what they needed. But you'll never know unless you try. You can't let fear control you." The man shook his head. "But fear is always there. What if I can't fix things? What if I end up hurting someone instead?" The officer was quiet for a moment, and then his voice softened. "You're not alone in that fear. Everyone who tries to make a difference feels it. But here's what you need to understand. Sometimes you don't get to fix everything. Sometimes your role is just to show up, to listen, to offer what you can. And sometimes that's all they need." The man was quiet for a long moment, the weight of the officer's words sinking in. He had been so focused on the outcome, so desperate to fix things, that he had forgotten about the value of the small, seemingly insignificant actions. "I've been trying to control everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I need to accept that I can't." The officer nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "That's the first step. Acceptance. And then you take the next step, even if you don't know where it's leading." The man looked out the window, the world outside still moving, still changing. He felt a sense of clarity settling over him, but it wasn't the kind of clarity he had expected. It wasn't the resolution of knowing exactly what to do next. It was the clarity that came with understanding that not every step would be perfect, and not every action would lead to the outcome he wanted. But it was enough to take the next step anyway. As the conversation between them wound down, the man stood up, feeling a quiet sense of resolve building inside him. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure how things would unfold. But he knew one thing for certain: he would keep trying. He would keep showing up. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. As he walked out of the coffee shop, he felt a strange peace within him. The world still felt uncertain, but now it was a world he was willing to face, one step at a time. He had no illusions about the road ahead. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments when he felt lost. But he had learned something that could not be unlearned, that the journey itself was where the change happened, even when the destination was unclear. And maybe that was the most important lesson of all. Weeks had passed, and the man's life was beginning to take on a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but somehow right. He woke each day with a quiet sense of purpose, his actions no longer driven by the same anger and frustration that had once clouded his every decision. He had made a promise to himself. He would show up, even when the path ahead felt uncertain. He didn't have all the answers, but he was no longer afraid to ask the questions. It was during one of his regular walks through the city that he saw her again, the little girl he had helped, the one who had shown him the power of small acts of kindness. She was standing at the corner of the street, holding her familiar sign, *, help me, *, but this time, there was something different about her. The smile that had once seemed tentative and unsure now looked brighter, more confident. Her eyes were filled with hope, and as the man approached, she greeted him with a warmth that spoke volumes. I made it," she said, her voice steady, almost triumphant. "I'm going to school. I'm going to be a scientist." The man's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. This little girl, who had once felt so small in the face of an overwhelming world, was now standing before him with the kind of determination he had once thought impossible. The road ahead for her was still uncertain, but the spark in her eyes was undeniable. "You really did it?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the gravity of her words had taken him by surprise. "You really made it happen." She nodded, her smile wide. "I didn't think it was possible, but you helped me believe. You showed me that even when it feels like no one cares, there's always someone who will." The man felt something deep stir inside him. A sense of pride, yes, but also a realization that he hadn't just helped her. She had helped him too. In her pursuit of her dreams, in her willingness to take a leap of faith, she had reminded him of something he had forgotten. That hope, no matter how small, had the power to change everything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world around them had faded away, and in that brief silence, they shared something unspoken. A connection that went beyond words. "I'm proud of you," he said at last, his voice filled with more emotion than he had expected. "I'm proud of what you've done." The girl looked down for a moment, her smile softening. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "You gave me the chance to believe in myself. You didn't just give me money or a handout. You gave me hope." The man swallowed, the weight of her words hitting him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had always thought that change was about fixing things, about solving problems. But now he understood it wasn't just about the outcome. It was about the belief, the faith, the trust that you could make a difference. "I didn't do anything special," he said, almost dismissing the idea of his own impact. I just wanted to help." The girl shook her head. "That was the special part. You cared. You saw me, and you gave me a chance." He looked at her, really looked at her. And in that moment, he realized something else. He had been given a chance, too. A chance to change, to evolve, to be more than the man he had been. She had taught him that the smallest gestures, moments of vulnerability, of kindness, could have the biggest impact. "I'll keep fighting," she added, her voice steady. "And I'll make sure that I give back. I'll make sure that other kids like me get the same chance." The man smiled, a rare and genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You will. I have no doubt." As the little girl walked away, her steps full of purpose, the man felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had been right all along. The road to change wasn't about making grand gestures or achieving perfection. It was about showing up, about believing in the possibility of something better, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against you. And sometimes, just sometimes, that belief was all it took to change the world. The man continued on his walk, but this time, there was no sense of uncertainty, no lingering doubt. He didn't know what the future held, and that was okay. He had learned that life wasn't about controlling everything. It was about choosing to act with kindness, with purpose, and with an open heart. And in that, he had found a peace he had never known. As he walked through the bustling streets, he couldn't help but notice the small acts of kindness unfolding all around him. The woman holding the door open for an elderly man. The stranger helping a lost child find their parents. These weren't the grand gestures he had once thought mattered most. No, these were the moments that mattered, the moments that quietly, powerfully, changed everything. And for the first time, the man realized that his journey wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the world around him, and the people he touched, even in the smallest ways. He had started this journey with a desire to fix the world, but he had learned that the world didn't need fixing. It just needed people who cared enough to show up. And that was enough.